So, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our fantastic panel. I'm a doctor, we've got architects and lawyers and various other folks here, and we all sort of understand that. How on earth do you end up being a composer, Cecilia?
Thank you. That's a good question, isn't it? I suppose we're all the same in that as children and as we grow up, we find things that really interest us, and then we find that perhaps we're quite good at something. I mean, I'm hopeless at maths, so that was out. But as far as music was concerned, I loved it from an early age. My background is musical. My father was principal flute at the Royal Opera House and played with all the big orchestras. So there was a lot of music in the house. And one of the things that I loved to do when I was small, young, early days, was to improvise. And I still do. And I consider improvisation the frozen composition, really, because improvisation is experimental. You're thinking out ideas, and eventually you get paper and pencil and get the stuff on the page. I do remember, though, that my mother would hear me improvising, and she would come rushing through and say, "Stop messing about. Just get on with some practice." And so I think it's really the messing about that actually leads to the creative ideas. And so then from then on, university, music conservatoire, teaching. And while I was teaching, I was thinking, I've always wanted to write and be a composer, but somehow I didn't have the opportunity. And it was really when my children got older. Now, I'm going to tell you, I came to really composing at the age-old. I was old. I was 47 by the time I actually started, and I thought I must get going, and I did a master's degree. But I have to tell you, it's much better to start earlier, because if you do, you are with your peers, and with luck, they like your music, and they go out and they play it, and they perform it. But when you get to the old age of 47, it's much more difficult. So by taking a master's degree, it meant that I then somehow came back into the academic world and was able to, I managed to get a residency with a chamber music group and with 2 choral music groups. So from there on, do you know the saying from Holst? Holst apparently said, "Nobody should compose unless the not doing of it becomes a positive nuisance to you." And so I think I have to say it did become a positive nuisance. So that's roughly how I got there.
Well, it's interesting. I think the sort of story of my writing is very much entwined with music, because that was the main thing I did growing up. I was always reading and very interested in writing, but it was a very private thing for me. But what I was doing more outwardly was performing music. I played the flute. I studied music, classical music, and then I got very involved in Indonesian music, which is what I did my PhD on. And actually, it was during my research period in Indonesia that I really started writing poetry. I think there was that sense of being away from, I don't know, maybe I'd been told not to do too much messing about or something. That feeling of being in a slightly different context where it somehow freed something up in me. But it's interesting, I feel like I owe a great deal to those music studies, even though when I look back, I did spend a lot of time doing something which in some ways feels a little unrelated to what I do. But actually, I don't think so. I think at the heart, particularly of poetry, is this response to the sound of words and thinking of words as a kind of music. And so I feel very grateful for all those experiences, because I think it's I hope given something to my writing, and it feels like a great pleasure now often to be collaborating with composers. I feel very separate from the composition process, but I suppose there's I hope perhaps an alertness to the sound of words that perhaps lends itself in certain ways to music sometimes.
I guess my background is there are some similarities, I guess, to yourself, in that I finished my music degree and didn't quite know what to do, and ended up teaching, because that seemed like the most sensible thing to do at that point, and a way of earning some money. And it took a long time before I really discovered what I wanted to do. And eventually was very lucky to be introduced to Paddy Russell at the Academy and to study on his choral conducting course. And it was really that changed my life and outlook and career, essentially. And now I pursue that as my main focus, but still working a lot with children, obviously with the youth choir here and also in local schools, and with a particular focus in opera as well, working for Opera Holland Park, really looking at languages, at working with choruses and stagecraft. So that's my background and main focus.
So, Cecilia and Kate, so as you know, in the genesis of the commission, we were thinking of themes like Henley, and quite became clear that was probably a bit too parochial, and then we thought about the Thames, and then we thought about rivers. We talked about some of the themes. Tell me, how did this then evolve, and what happened with, and how did we end up with the Isis listening?
Thank you. How did it turn to ice? Well, it was interesting. When Peter Asprey was here, he said very much what you have said, Tim, that the river, Henley, all that was a starting point. I love Henley, by the way, and I spent many years here because my brother was a rower. He rowed for his school here, he rowed for university, and then he rowed for Leander. So I spent a lot of time on the towpath. I thought, well, if you have the river, rivers change, you can have them turning to ice. And then my thoughts turned to ice. And I do remember as a teenager struggling, I'm afraid, but I loved a part of it, to read Orlando by Virginia Woolf. And there's a wonderful excerpt in that about the frost fair. And I began thinking about the frost fairs and how that could translate into music. I was fascinated by why there were so many frost fairs. I think there were 7 main ones, weren't there? And the biggest of them all is the one that you're singing about, which Kate has so wonderfully found the words for, the 1683 to 1684 one. That's where I began my thoughts. And then I was thinking, well, it would be rather nice to have some kind of historical timeline with this and to bring it up to date. And of course, we have such an alarming situation at the moment. I don't know if you remember, in 2014, the Icelanders put up a memorial to their glacier. The glacier is called OK for short. I couldn't possibly do the Icelandic one. But they put up a memorial that says in English, a letter to the future, really saying, if you can judge us on what we did or didn't do. And in 2019, there was a real sort of ceremony marking its death. So that is all alarming. Then I happened to watch a program on BBC Two about moulin, or moulins, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it. And of course, a moulin is a mill in French. And I was really horrified by the way in which the meltwater, the fresh water would come across the top of the glacier and make these huge holes, some of them as big as 10 meters. And we could see, I think it may still be available on television, you could look down these huge holes into the most beautiful blue. I mean, it looks absolutely spectacular. But the water would go down, and once the fresh water is under the glacier, it melts it. So it speeds the whole process up. So that was something that I really felt I didn't know about it. By the way, there are no moulins in the Antarctica if you're doing it in a quiz night, just so you know. But the other thing, and also I think about 2 weeks ago, there's a really interesting program about Greenland and the ice melting there and how the livelihoods are having to change. So I then rang Kate. We had worked together, and I thought she would be ideal for this, and put all these ideas to Kate. And would you like to carry on from there?
Thank you. Yes, it was a very lovely phone call, and felt like a very charged and exciting prospect to work on. And I think this kind of beginning in the 17th century, I think as a poet, felt like a really rich seam. I think we both sort of share a passion for that kind of florid, so very often very beautiful, intriguing vocabulary, and also the wonderful spellings, smoking with an A and things like that, and lots of capital letters. And I, yes, sort of did lots of kind of delving. Yes, that first movement, it's interesting, there's a quite famous account of the Frost Fairs by a diarist called John Evelyn, which is sort of everywhere online, and I read through it and found it very fascinating. Also this kind of idea that the Little Ice Age, as it was called, this period of very, very cold winters, was in its own way, although the Frost Fairs were this wonderful kind of period of events of pageantry and excitement, it was also a very terrifying time. There was a terrible scarcity of food and crops dying and things like that. So I was quite interested if I could find a text that explored both those aspects. And then I live in Oxford and came across this contemporary document from 1684, which, yes, just there, a pamphlet about the Frost Fairs. And so I had this wonderful day in Magdalen College Library where I transcribed the whole thing and thought, my goodness, this is just filled with the most wonderful sort of words and phrases, and I feel that there's a poem here. Yes, and then I suppose it felt very potent and important to be thinking about these contemporary settings. So I came across this wonderful quote from a climate scientist called Josh Willis: "When the ocean speaks, the Greenland ice sheet listens," about this the kind of warming coastal waters which are chipping away at the ice and causing this additional melt. And I suppose this idea of the ice listening as a musical idea, as a poetic idea, felt strong. And so for that second movement, I think Cecilia had this idea of a lament, and I suppose, yes, the idea of the ice, and I suppose all the history it holds. I think it's in the Into the Ice documentary. It says about there are air bubbles that are 20,000 years old, and this incredible sort of compression of history that's there that will kind of lost. I suppose the idea of the ice being kind of almost sort of made to shed itself, or kind of, yes, I suppose I thought somehow its dignity is lost in its melting or something.
Well, I was just thinking exactly that. Just like a tree has rings, so does the ice core. And I know you've probably seen programs on television where ice cores have been extracted, and you can see all the different layers, all the different colours. So yes, it's like the history. I do want to say, and there's possibly something to say later, Kate, I'm just thinking about the collaboration of things. After we spoke, Kate sent this to me. Now, very often when I see something that's sent to me to set, I might say, well, is there a possibility to do this or extend this a little bit? I haven't touched it, except for one word, which I revealed today. I said, is it okay? I've added in an and. And that happens with seep and swell. So.
Thank you. Well, I'd say it was a very helpful conversation we had that felt like it was just the right amount of information and sort of inspiration, but without feeling like it was too contained, or that it had lots of space left in it to explore. So it was, and yes, and it was wonderful. I'm glad that the documentary has been shared around, this Into the Ice, because yes, you spoke so passionately about this kind of the sort of strange and horrifying beauty of these moulins, and actually also had a really helpful conversation with Heather Lane, who is, I've written it down, librarian and keeper of collections at the Scott Polar Research Institute. I mean, a wonderful conversation, a very chastening one in terms of the kind of prospects for humanity that felt quite terrifying, actually, talking about ice ages, about that actually there's a possibility that if things tilt in a certain way, that actually rather than lurching towards global heating, there could actually be a kind of another absolutely catastrophic ice age causing mass migration. And so I suppose actually that conversation also it lent another kind of weight to the project, which felt daunting, but also very energizing to research and to think very deeply about these words. Yeah.
Thank you. And another thought, and I think probably you may agree with this, that I think as creative artists, we need to be thinking of where we are now we need to be writing about things that are going on now. And I think if there's anything that we can say that actually causes people to look a little bit further, think a little bit more about what's going on, this is something that I feel passionately about and hope that it might stimulate interest somehow.
It's funny, I was also thinking about the idea of beauty, because I think the really intriguing thing about the Moulin is they are just staggeringly beautiful. If you've seen, I mean, they sort of feel like a complete wonder of nature, this absolutely vibrant, crazy, shrill blueness to them. And it was interesting looking through your, Cecilia sent me the score, which I haven't heard, but was able to look through and have a sense of. And I suppose, yes, it's an interesting question about how one talks about such difficult, painful, upsetting things, but also the kind of power of beauty to, as a way of communicating and a way of bringing hope, I suppose, or of bringing energy to such difficult topics.
Well, it's hugely interesting and challenging and fascinating as well, because obviously so much of what I usually do is music that exists already. So there are recordings, there's particularly with older works, real performance history, it's been done this way for centuries, it will always be performed this way. And so there's kind of the weight of history on your shoulders as you approach most works, even recent pieces. And so the joy of this is having something that is brand new. The dust hasn't had a chance to settle on it. Nobody has seen it yet. And so you're looking at this virgin territory. It's musically, it's wonderfully exciting and very engaging, actually. I guess the closest analogy I can think of is maybe like having a new play, perhaps, where you've got the words on the page, you've got the setting, you've got the characters and the rough overview, but in order for it to come alive and to have a real presence, it has to come off the page. It has to have people do it. And it's exactly the same with a new piece of music here that Cecilia's created. There's sounds on the page. There's bits that are written down, but that's it. There's nothing. So you have to go from that point to listening to it, thinking, what's Cecilia trying to express here? What's the purpose of this line? How does this all fit together? So, for me, I have no idea if this is right or wrong, but I tend to do quite a nuts and bolts approach. So I sing through all the parts. I play through the piano part. I look at the parts together. I look at it horizontally. What are the tunes? What are the melodies? What are the themes? I look at it vertically. What are the harmonies? What's the tonal areas? Where are we going? How does it fit together? I look at the structure. How is everything coming together? What things are layered up? And then I look at it analytically as well. How has the composer, how Cecilia, decide, or why has she decided to do this here? What's the compositional technique? We've got some echo effects, we've got some mimicry, we've got canonic stuff. Why is that there? How does that interact with the text? And then from that, I then get into the rehearsal room, and it sounds completely different to me. To me bashing away at the piano at home, sort of going, singing through the parts. And honestly, that's the most astonishing thing. Even if it's just, 4, 6, 8 bars that we've worked together as a choir, hearing that for the first time all together is brilliant. It's absolutely terrific, and I'm very much enjoying that process.
You heard about perhaps the words and the lyric and the themes. But I wonder if you want to talk about the music, the musicality, and of the 3 different movements, and what's going on.
Each one very different. The first one I thought of being very busy, active, as you've noticed, and also, I played around with something. I had a bit of fun, and I know you'll know exactly the bit I mean when I say the word weather. Is that right? And I thought how to do this, how to present it in a way which might be easy to learn. So I thought if it's hard as weather, and that's all you have as a block, and then we overlap it so that there's a continuity. And as you probably saw from the page, teeth chattering. that's what it was supposed to be. So what Kate, I think, has done so well with the end of this is to actually bring the reality back. So with all the vibrancy and the setting up of the booths and the trumpets and the drums and great activity and chariots going everywhere, then it goes into the countryside and into the stillness and the cold and the reality. And that is, of course, where it comes down. And so the whole thing sort of slenders out into something much, much quieter. I think I have used the words, haven't I? We tread backwards. And of course, you've noticed I put the words backwards because I thought, that's how we were going to do it. So that movement ends quietly. It fades away. And then the second movement, it was lovely when Richard said I had a soprano soloist at my disposal. And I thought this one would be rather fun to have you as a sort of commentary with the voice of the ice, perhaps, and the sort of backing group, as it were, from the choir, as the voice of the ice listening. And that too fades away. And what you will also notice with the third movement, that fades away. But I feel that the third movement has got activity and rhythm, so that it does have that propulsion, which of course is going on all the time with the mill. And I think you have probably noticed this. I couldn't resist it. I love the words dizzy and dazzle. And you know what I've done with those. So I thought if you very picturesquely start at the top and have dizzy, going dizzy, 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 then that might give a sense of the moulin falling down to the depths, and the same with dazzle. But I don't know, does it matter whether a work ends on a quieter, more thoughtful note? I mean, I feel this is a piece that really is to make people respond perhaps more thoughtfully to what's going on. So I couldn't bring myself to give an exuberant, triumphant ending. I don't feel that's quite appropriate. So I hope that gives a little bit of a sense of what each movement is, a contrast between the three of them. And as I said, to set Kate's words, she made it easy for me.
The words came first, although I'd say the words followed a sort of philosophical and musical impulse from Cecilia. So a conversation where we talked about the ideas of the piece, but also the kind of, it was very helpful for me to hear from Cecilia the sort of musical ideas actually that you had in mind. So in some sense the music kind of came first, but then in the kind of bar to bar sense, I guess the words then, they're the first thing that's put on paper.
Well, that's right. There's always this discussion, isn't it? Which comes first, the words or the music? And also there's a discussion, which is more important, the words or the music? 50-50. Yes. So there's a conversation, and then the words, and then the music. And I think actually as a composer, I always feel I want to be really careful with how I set the words. I want to be as faithful and clear as possible. And I think what I value very much with Kate's writing is it's not full of conjunctions and prepositions and all sorts of things. So I had to add in my own and. It does in a way, because one of the things I do when I'm writing is to sing everything myself, whether it's a bass line or a tenor line. So I try to sing everything and see how it sits on my voice and whether it's something that I want to sing myself. But what I do try to do is, and you're probably going to call me out and say, well, you haven't done it there in bar 91, is to put note plants somewhere in the texture so that you would be able to find your note more easily. Now, if I'm writing for a professional choir, I probably wouldn't bother, just leave it to them. But I think it's very important that for a lovely choir like you, that that you feel comfortable, that you can find the note and you don't have to go digging for it. So I hope there are a few notes to find there. I think probably Mozart, Rossini and Benjamin Britten were the 3 composers I can think of who never needed the piano. I think everybody else probably does. I mean, if you think of Stravinsky and The Rite of Spring, he obviously sat there for days banging around at the stamping chord. You can hear the hand shapes. What I do before I write anything is I spend a lot of time thinking about it and shaping the structure of it in my head. And I have an idea of what the mood of it is, or to try and set the scene for myself. But yes, I do use a piano, and I use the computer last. So I actually still write on manuscript paper with a pencil. And then when I'm happy with what I'm writing, I will put it on the computer. But I do feel if I put something straight onto the computer, it's become solidified and much more difficult to manipulate. So I like the sort of handheld pencil.
It's not just being good at what you do. It's not just having the talent. It's having the determination and the mindset to say, right, I'm quite good at this, but I need to be exceptional at this, and that requires time, effort, and frankly hard work. That's one strand of it. At the end of that, you can then do your job, wonderful, but then how do you get work? How do you network? How do you organise your finances? How do you plan your time? How do you get yourself from A to B? How do you organise the nuts and bolts of your life that it doesn't, that whatever it is you're trying to achieve doesn't overshadow everything else in your life? And that's a very, certainly for me, I think that's probably been one of my greatest struggles, is finding a balance between the professional life and having a life other than that. Don't lose sight, I think, of the thing that drives you, which is the fun and enjoyment and the wonderful times you can have as a creative artist in whatever field, but also have a dose of realism there behind you as well, perhaps.
I didn't mean to be contrary, but if you said don't, I say do. I think with poetry, it's a very interesting thing. I mean, I do make my living now from writing, but I think there was a period in my life where I made a bit of my living from writing, and that my writing felt equally satisfying and meaningful to me. And I mean, of course, there was a period of my life where I didn't make any money from writing, and writing still felt absolutely vital and meaningful for me. And I think poetry, actually, I think is one of the most sort of democratic forms somehow, because there are all sorts of ways of sending your poetry out into the world. And what I love about poems is they're short, so one doesn't go very well and you just write another one. But in terms of advice, I would say finding a sort of community of people. So for writing, I think it's quite a solitary activity, but finding a group that meets regularly and sharing what you're doing, and I can imagine that applies to any sort of creative activity, finding some kind of group of people around you who are constructive, constructively critical, and supportive, and for whom you can write for. I think that I still attend a sort of weekly workshop with other writers where we share our work and reflect on what we're doing. And sometimes when I'm stuck, I think, well, I can write something to share with them, and that keeps me going. So I think finding some kind of community, and I think the amazing thing about the internet is that has and particularly maybe post-pandemic, there is so much opportunity to share and find ways to connect with other people. So I certainly, in terms of writing, I would urge anyone at any age. It's a form that is open, and all you have to do is put pen to paper and keep going.
I'm somewhere between the two. As Kate says, it is such a solitary business, whatever you're doing, creating. And I think one of the great things is when you're working with somebody else. But something that, of course, I have experienced is that if you're not with a community of performers, it is quite difficult to get your work heard if you are becoming a composer. So I think it is very important to have that passion, to want to do it. Also to remember, it doesn't have to be your career. and you can keep it as something that you really enjoy. But on the other hand, if you really do want to keep moving on it, find a community of singers and performers who will perform your work, because I think that is the thing that will communicate itself to the listener, and that's the way more work will come. I think there's always a feeling you can only get your music heard if you have it published. Well, that's certainly not the case now, because of course you've got so much available to you on the internet. So I think if you want to do it, just go for it. That's a really interesting question. And I think I agree with you. We are both a bit sparse, but I do think with sparseness comes clarity. And I have in the past been given words to set that are so dense, so complicated, that they have been really difficult to make an impact on. Now, I agree, yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that it is layered. What I feel is we have a program note, we give what we can, but also the words are there. And I think what we all do as listeners and performers is to combine all of it, to read the text and to understand the text, and then to read the program note. So in a way, it's a DIY job that you are putting it all together yourself. But the important thing I feel is not to obscure either the words or the meaning behind it.
Oh, it's so interesting that yes, because I don't think of my poems as sparse, but I suppose I think of them as I weigh each word very, very carefully. But it's interesting, when I was working with that 17th century text, I feel like there are so many, for me, the images feel very rich and almost florid, but it's, I guess, on the page, when I look at it as a poem, I suppose it is quite sparse. But yes, it's interesting, I suppose, for me, each word, it's about trying to give space for each word to sort of sing in the imagination a little bit. But it's, yes, I guess there's a certain discipline I find when I'm writing poems to not to overtell, and especially when something is to be set to music, yes, a clarity. And I suppose the idea of ice itself, there's something so, it's so still, it's so white, there's various qualities of it that kind of, I suppose, encourage a certain sparseness and a stillness that I guess was what I must have been trying to conjure up. But it's very nice to feel it might be a layered piece. I think that's what we were hoping for.
It's a thrill, and it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because you work on a piece for a considerable amount of time, spend a lot of time thinking about every single detail. So I kind of know it intimately, all the notes, every single note is there for a particular reason. And coupled with that is the fact that writing music, writing poetry, writing all of these things, you're on your own. So there's something delightful when you're let out and you can come and meet the people who are doing your work. So it's a delight, it really is. And it's lovely, you see, working with somebody like Richard, who I feel listens, and I know that, you know, if we have any exchange of ideas or anything, it'll all work. The words, I think, give the rhythm. So I play around with the words a lot. I read them out, I say them in different times, and there are certain things that then fit. I mean, what I find interesting is that whatever the words are, I'm absolutely blooming determined that they're going to fit. So I will go on until I find something that really works. And not everything works straight away, but it's being playful with it, and finding. Were you thinking that I've used rhythmic ideas rather too much?
So I usually work, I begin in a very sort of expansive way, in the sense that I don't begin writing in lines. I just usually begin with a notebook and kind of dispersed. And actually, I was looking back because I had all my notes from my conversation with Heather Lane from the Polar Institute. So and they were sort of interspersed between all the notes. And I was looking at various lines and ideas and how they got discarded. And I suppose in a way I think of that as a really important part of poetry, as a kind of distillation. And I don't think it's quite rare that happens without a process of a sort of splurge and then a kind of concentration that comes from that. So yes, I have lots of bits and bobs that I don't use. And I think for this, I also felt like research was very important, and that there needed to be lots of material that I took time with, that I couldn't include everything, but that needed to be in the mix somehow. So I suppose that's not necessarily discarded. It's fed in, but it's perhaps not fed in a such an explicit way. It's just, I hope, there as one of these layers, perhaps.
The point where I start, I keep that material, and then I keep going, and then I go back to the material that I had at the beginning to see how I got from there to see whether it'll help me for the next time. It never does. I don't know how many of you have heard of the composer John McCabe. He died in 2015. He was a wonderful composer. I remember he once said that you have the DNA of the music that you're writing in the first chord that you write. So it's being careful of the first image that you create. But I think all ideas are expendable, and I'm not precious about the ideas. I mean, I sometimes have an idea and I'm interrupted, and it's gone. So I look for the next one. So I'm not too worried about finding the next one. But I think it would be awful if one were thinking, gosh, I've got to hang on to everything. But yeah. My floor is very untidy.
So, thank you very much. Thank you. Let's just thank our panel, Cecilia, Kate, and Richard.